In Marilyn's diner, a quiet man reading his morning newspaper was about to face public humiliation. What began as peaceful breakfast service turned deadly when Phoenix security contractors launched their assault. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical small-town regular. For 15 years, he was Special Operations Command Classified Activities Division, known for dismantling international arms trafficking networks that reached the highest levels of government. When private military contractors breached the diner's entrance, they had no idea they were facing a decorated operative. Seagal coordinated the diner's defense with tactical precision that would trigger a federal investigation spanning multiple agencies. What began as mistaken identity would become America's largest government corruption scandal. The small town would never be the same after the briefcase revealed evidence of treason at the highest levels of power. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Marilyn's diner cast their familiar pale glow across cracked vinyl booths and chrome-trimmed tables as the early morning crowd settled into their routines. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, creating that perfect symphony of small town comfort that had remained unchanged for decades. Steven Seagal sat in his usual corner booth, the weathered leather briefcase beside him serving as a silent companion to his morning ritual. The local newspaper spread before him like a barrier between himself and the world, his fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug with practiced ease, steam rising from the black coffee within as his dark eyes scanned the headlines with the methodical precision of someone who had learned long ago that information was survival. The sports section held little interest, but the crime reports always drew his attention, not out of morbid curiosity, but from a deeper understanding of human nature that came from experiences he preferred to keep buried. Marilyn Harris wiped down the counter with the efficiency of someone who had been perfecting the motion for 30 years, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun that had seen better days but still held the authority of a woman who ran her establishment. With equal parts warmth and steel, she glanced over at Steven's booth, noting the way he always positioned himself with a clear view of both entrances, the way his shoulders never fully relaxed, even in the safety of her diner. These small details painted a picture she had been quietly observing for months. The morning regulars filtered in with clockwork precision. Ernie Kowalski claimed his usual stool at the counter, his weathered hands cradling a cup of coffee that had gone from piping hot to lukewarm, while he stared out the window watching the town slowly wake up. His silence was comfortable, familiar, a testament to the unspoken understanding that some men preferred their thoughts to their words. The radio hummed softly in the background, a local station playing classic country that nobody really listened to, but everyone somehow knew by heart. Steven turned a page of his newspaper, the subtle crinkle of newsprint, the only sound he contributed to the morning's quiet soundtrack. He had perfected the art of being present without being noticed, of occupying space without drawing attention. It was a skill that had served him well in his previous life and continued to provide comfort in this new existence where anonymity was not just preferred but essential. The door chimes jingled, their cheerful announcement of new arrivals, but the sound carried an edge of disruption that seemed to alter the diner's peaceful atmosphere. Officer Daniel Harris burst through the entrance with the kind of energy that suggested he had been waiting all night for something interesting to happen, his uniform crisp and pressed to military standards, his badge catching the light with each deliberate step he took across the checkerboard linoleum floor. Officer Sarah Lopez followed close behind, her approach more measured and professional, her dark eyes sweeping the interior with the trained observation of someone who had learned to notice details that others might miss. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with whatever had brought them to the diner this morning. Danny's gaze locked onto Steven's booth like a heat-seeking missile, finding its target, the tension in his jaw visible even from across the room as he nudged Sarah with his elbow and nodded in Steven's direction. Sarah's brow furrowed slightly, a small gesture that spoke volumes about her uncertainty regarding whatever suspicions had driven them here. Steven felt their presence before he looked up, the subtle shift in the diner's energy alerting him to the change in dynamics. He had developed an almost supernatural awareness of when he was being watched, studied. Evaluated, it was a survival mechanism that had kept him alive through situations far more dangerous than a small-town diner, but the familiar tightness in his chest reminded him that danger came in many forms. Marilyn sensed the change too, her maternal instincts picking up on the subtle tension that had invaded her sanctuary. She moved behind the counter with purpose, her movements slightly more deliberate as she prepared for whatever was about to unfold. The way she positioned herself suggested she was ready to defend her establishment and the people within it if necessary. Danny approached Stephen's booth with the swagger of someone who believed his badge gave him authority over everyone in the room, his hand resting casually on his utility belt in a gesture that was meant to be intimidating but came across as rehearsed. Sarah remained near the entrance, her position strategic, allowing her to observe while maintaining distance from whatever confrontation was brewing. The newspaper trembled almost imperceptibly in Stephen's hands as he sensed the approaching storm. He had hoped this day would never come, had believed that his careful construction of a quiet, anonymous life might allow him to fade into the background permanently, but the look in Danny's eyes suggested that hope was about to be shattered. Across the linoleum floor of Marilyn's diner, along with the peaceful morning routine he had grown to cherish, Danny Harris planted himself beside Stephen's booth like a tree that had taken root in hostile soil, his presence immediately transforming the quiet corner into a stage for confrontation. The other patrons pretended to focus on their breakfast, but their attention was drawn to the unfolding drama like moths to a dangerous flame. Stephen slowly folded his newspaper, creating a crisp rectangle that he placed beside his coffee cup with deliberate precision, every movement calculated to project calm while his mind raced through possibilities and escape routes. Well, Danny's voice carried across the diner with theatrical volume designed to ensure every patron could hear the show he was about to perform. If it isn't Ray Matheson, thought you could hide out in our little town, did you? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from burnt coffee, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and uncomfortable silence. Stephen's dark eyes met Danny's gaze without flinching, his expression remaining neutral despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. I'm sorry, officer, but I think you have me confused with someone else. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect without raising his volume. The contrast between his calm response and Danny's aggressive posture was stark enough to make several diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. Don't play games with me, Matheson. Danny leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, his wedding ring clicking against the formica surface. We've got reports of someone matching your description hitting convenience stores and gas stations across 3 counties. Figured you'd eventually turn up somewhere like this, laying low until the heat died down. Sarah Lopez moved closer to the booth, her expression troubled as she watched her partner's performance. She had reviewed the case files that morning, and while there were similarities between Stephen and the suspect photos, the connection felt thin, circumstantial at best. The man sitting calmly in the booth bore a superficial resemblance to Ray Matheson, but something in his demeanor suggested depths that a common criminal would not possess. Marilyn Harris approached the booth with a coffee pot in hand, her maternal instincts flaring as she witnessed the public humiliation of a customer who had never caused trouble in her establishment. Officer Harris, she said, using Danny's surname with pointed formality, this man has been a regular customer for months, never caused any problems, always pays his bill and tips. Well, maybe you should reconsider. Danny turned his attention to Marilyn, his face flushing with irritation at being challenged in front of an audience. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is police business, and I'd ask you to step back while we handle it. His tone carried the condescending edge of someone who believed his uniform granted him automatic respect regardless of his behavior. Stephen watched the exchange between Marilyn and Danny, recognizing the protective instinct that had prompted her intervention. He felt a wave of gratitude mixed with concern for dragging this kind woman into whatever storm was about to break over his carefully constructed life. The briefcase beside him seemed to pulse with potential energy, like a bomb waiting for the wrong wire to be touched. Look, officer, Stephen said, his voice remaining steady despite the growing attention from other patrons. I understand you're doing your job, but I can assure you I'm not the person you're looking for. I have identification if you'd like to see it. He reached slowly toward the briefcase, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, but Danny's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon. Keep your hands where I can see them. Danny barked, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. "Sarah, get his ID, and let's see what kind of fake documents this guy is carrying." The suggestion that Stephen's identification was fraudulent drew murmurs from the other diners, some supportive of the officers, and others expressing doubt about the confrontation they were witnessing. Ernie Kowalski turned on his counterstool to get a better view of the proceedings, his weathered face creased with concern as he watched the situation escalate beyond what seemed reasonable for a simple case of mistaken identity. He had been observing Stephen for weeks, noting the man's quiet dignity and the way he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen more of the world than most. Sarah reluctantly approached the briefcase, her instincts telling her that something about this situation was not adding up correctly. The way Stephen had offered his identification without hesitation, the calm manner in which he faced accusations that should have provoked either anger or fear in an innocent person, these details suggested complexity beneath the surface that her partner was either missing or choosing to ignore. The diner had become a theater of small-town drama, with Stephen cast as the villain in a play. He had never auditioned for the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every judgment being passed by people who knew nothing about him or his history, pressed down like a physical force. But he had endured worse humiliations in service to his country, and he would endure this one as well. Danny's hand hovered over Stephen's briefcase like a bird of prey preparing to strike, the moment stretching with unbearable tension as the entire diner held its collective breath, waiting to see what revelations the worn leather case might contain. The morning's peaceful routine had been shattered, completely replaced by the kind of drama that would be discussed in hushed tones for weeks to come, regardless of how the confrontation ultimately resolved. Stephen's fingers moved with practiced precision as he unlatched the weathered brass clasps of his briefcase, the soft clicks echoing in the suddenly silent diner like gunshots in a cathedral. Every patron had abandoned any pretense of eating their breakfast, instead watching with the fascination of spectators at a car accident as the leather case opened to reveal its mysterious contents. The interior of the briefcase was organized with military precision, documents arranged in protective sleeves, photographs secured with metal clips, and various credentials bearing official seals that caught the fluorescent light like jewels in a treasure chest. Danny's confident smirk began to falter as his eyes took in the array of materials that clearly indicated this was no ordinary collection of fake identifications. Sarah leaned closer, her training in document analysis immediately recognizing the authenticity of the seals, watermarks, and security features embedded in the papers before them. "Danny," she whispered, her voice tight with growing concern, "these look legitimate." She picked up a laminated card bearing Stephen's photograph, alongside text that referenced classifications and clearance levels that made her pulse quicken. "Of course they look legitimate," Danny blustered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Guy like this probably has connections that can forge anything these days." He reached for one of the documents, but Sarah caught his wrist, preventing him from disturbing what was clearly a carefully organized archive of sensitive materials. Stephen watched their examination with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that truth eventually revealed itself regardless of initial skepticism. His dark eyes moved between the two officers, reading their body language and facial expressions like a book written in a language he had mastered through years of necessity. Marilyn moved closer, wiping her hands on her apron as she peered over Sarah's shoulder at the open briefcase, her practical mind immediately recognizing that whatever Stephen had been hiding, it was far more significant than the quiet life he had been living in her diner. "Sweet Mary," she breathed, her voice barely audible, "what have you been carrying around in there?" Ernie swiveled completely on his counter stool, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience reading people and situations. "Told you that man wasn't what he seemed," he said to nobody in particular, his gravelly voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been proven correct. "Been watching him for weeks, and you can tell when a man's got history." Sarah lifted a photograph from the briefcase, her breath catching as she recognized the face in the image. It was unmistakably Stephen, but younger, wearing military dress uniform and standing beside men whose faces she recognized from newspaper articles and television news reports, high-ranking officials whose names carried weight in intelligence circles. "Steven Seagal," she read from the identification card, her voice reflecting growing amazement. "Special Operations Command, Classified Activities Division." She looked up at the man sitting calmly in the booth, his expression unchanged despite the revelation of his true identity. "You're not Ray Matheson." Danny snatched the card from Sarah's hands, studying it with the desperation of someone watching his certainty crumble like a house of cards. "This could still be fake," he insisted, but his voice had lost all authority. "Sophisticated forgeries are easier to make than ever these days." "Officer Harris," Stephen said, his voice carrying new weight now that his identity was partially revealed. "Those documents are authentic, and they represent a significant security risk if they fall into the wrong hands. I've been protecting them for reasons that go far beyond personal safety." The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from confrontational drama to something approaching awe as the patrons realized they had been sharing breakfast space with someone whose life story was clearly far more complex than anyone had imagined. The quiet man in the corner booth had transformed from suspected criminal to mysterious figure with government connections. Sarah continued examining the contents of the briefcase, finding documents with official letterheads bearing dates spanning several years and referencing operations and assignments that painted a picture of someone deeply embedded in the intelligence community. These reference operations in multiple countries, she said, her professional fascination overriding her initial skepticism. "Ma'am," Stephen addressed Marilyn directly, "I apologize for bringing this kind of attention to your establishment. I had hoped to keep my past buried, but it seems that was overly optimistic." His tone carried genuine regret for the disruption his presence had caused to the peaceful sanctuary she had created. Danny stood back from the booth, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion as the foundation of his accusations crumbled beneath the weight of evidence. He had been so certain of Stephen's guilt that he had rushed to judgment without considering alternative explanations. The public nature of his mistake would haunt him long after this morning ended. The briefcase sat open between them like Pandora's box, revealing secrets that transformed everything the patrons thought they knew about the quiet man who had been sharing their morning routine for months. The documents suggested involvement in operations that existed in shadows and required the kind of discretion that had kept Stephen's true identity hidden until this moment. Sarah closed the briefcase carefully, her mind racing with questions about what kind of situation she and her partner had stumbled into. The morning had begun with a simple case of mistaken identity, but was rapidly evolving into something that would require careful handling and possibly consultation with federal authorities. Sarah guided Stephen to a booth in the far corner of the diner, away from the curious ears of other patrons, while Danny remained near the original table, nursing his wounded pride and struggling to process the complete collapse of his confident accusations. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor, as if the very architecture of the diner was participating in the revelation unfolding within its walls. "Mr. Seagal," Sarah began, her voice respectful but firm, "I need to understand what we're dealing with here. Those documents suggest involvement in operations that most local law enforcement would never encounter. Why are you carrying them around in a diner briefcase in a small town in the middle of nowhere?" Stephen cradled his coffee mug between weathered hands that had clearly seen more action than most people experienced in a lifetime. His dark eyes reflected depths of experience that seemed to age him beyond his years as he considered how much truth he could safely reveal to this earnest young officer. 3 years ago, I was part of a joint operation involving multiple agencies." He began, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of painful memories. "We were tracking arms dealers who had connections to both organized crime and certain government officials who shall remain nameless. The operation was successful from a tactical standpoint, but politically it became complicated." Sarah leaned forward, her notepad forgotten, as she focused entirely on Stephen's words, recognizing the careful way he chose each phrase to convey maximum information while revealing minimum detail. It was the speaking pattern of someone trained in operational security who understood that loose lips could cost lives. "Someone within our own circle was feeding information to the targets." Stephen continued, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. "By the time we realized we had been compromised, 3 good agents were dead, and I was being positioned as the scapegoat for an operation that had been sabotaged from within." The official report blamed tactical errors, but those of us who survived knew the truth. Marilyn moved quietly between tables, refilling coffee cups, and clearing breakfast plates, but her attention remained focused on the conversation taking place in the corner booth. She had spent enough years observing human nature to recognize genuine pain when she heard it, and Stephen's carefully controlled voice carried the kind of hurt that came from betrayal by trusted colleagues. The briefcase contains evidence of that betrayal. Stephen set his eyes moving to check the positions of other patrons in a gesture so automatic he probably wasn't aware of doing it. Financial records, communication transcripts, photographs that prove certain officials were receiving payments in exchange for operational intelligence. Danny approached the booth, his earlier swagger replaced by uncertain steps and a troubled expression. The reality of his mistake was settling in like a stone in his stomach, and he was beginning to understand that he had stumbled into something far beyond his experience or authority. "Sarah, we need to call this in," Danny said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "If what he's saying is true, then we're dealing with federal matters that are way above our pay grade." The admission that he was out of his depth came reluctantly, but with growing conviction. Sarah nodded her agreement while continuing to study Stephen's face for signs of deception, but finding only the tired honesty of someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. "Who else knows you have these documents?" she asked. "Very few people are aware of their existence," Stephen replied, "and most of those who know would prefer they remain buried permanently. I had planned to eventually turn them over to the appropriate authorities, but finding trustworthy channels has proven more difficult than anticipated." Ernie's voice carried from the counter where he had been quietly listening to as much of the conversation as distance and discretion allowed. "Man can't run from his past forever," he said, addressing his coffee cup, but clearly intending his words for everyone in the diner. "Eventually, truth has a way of catching up, no matter how far you travel or how deep you bury it." The wisdom in the old man's words seemed to resonate with Stephen, who looked toward the counter with something approaching gratitude for the understanding implicit in Ernie's comment, the solidarity of one man who had lived long enough to understand the complexities of loyalty, duty, and moral compromise. A cell phone began ringing from within the briefcase, its electronic tone cutting through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. Stephen's expression immediately tensed as he recognized the distinctive ringtone assigned to a contact he had hoped never to hear from again. "I need to answer that," Stephen said, his voice carrying new urgency as he reached for the phone. "But I should warn you that doing so might change everything for everyone in this diner." His eyes moved around the room, taking in each face, each person who might be affected by whatever information was about to be delivered through that insistent electronic summons. Sarah exchanged glances with Danny, both officers recognizing that they had crossed a threshold from routine police work into something that would require resources and expertise far beyond their small-town department. The morning had begun with a simple case of mistaken identity, but was rapidly evolving into a situation that might require federal intervention. The phone continued ringing, its urgent tone serving as a countdown to revelations that would transform not only Stephen's carefully constructed quiet life, but potentially the lives of everyone who had witnessed the morning's events. The peaceful sanctuary of Marilyn's diner was about to become something else entirely, a crossroads where past and present collided with consequences none of them could yet imagine. Stephen's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he lifted the phone from the briefcase, the electronic device feeling heavier than it should, as if weighted with the gravity of conversations that could reshape destinies. The caller ID displayed only a series of numbers that meant nothing to casual observers, but everything to someone who had once lived in a world where anonymous contacts could mean the difference between life and death. "Falcon, this is Control." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, carrying the kind of authority that had once commanded Stephen's immediate attention and unquestioning obedience. "We have reason to believe your position has been compromised. Extraction protocols are now in effect." Stephen's jaw tightened as he processed the implications of those words, the code names and operational language, transporting him instantly back to a world he had tried desperately to leave behind. The peaceful sanctuary of Marilyn's diner suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper in a hurricane. "Negative Control," Stephen replied, his voice automatically dropping into the clipped cadence of operational communication. "Situation is contained and civilian exposure is minimal." He glanced around the diner, taking inventory of innocent faces that had become unwilling participants in a drama they could never have anticipated. Sarah leaned closer, trying to follow the cryptic conversation, while Danny positioned himself near the window. His earlier embarrassment replaced by growing concern as he scanned the street outside for signs of whatever threat had prompted this mysterious phone call. The morning traffic seemed normal, but his instincts were screaming that normalcy was about to be shattered. Falcon, the materials you carry are now designated priority alpha. The voice continued with mechanical precision. Private contractors have been deployed to secure them by any means necessary. Your cooperation is no longer optional. The blood drained from Stephen's face as he understood the true meaning behind those carefully chosen words. Private contractors meant mercenaries, individuals with no accountability to laws or regulations who would complete their mission regardless of collateral damage. The bureaucratic language was a thin veneer over a death sentence for anyone who stood in their way. How long do we have? Stephen asked, his question directed at the phone, but his eyes meeting Sarah's gaze with an intensity that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. She had been trained to handle dangerous situations, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this kind of existential threat. Visual confirmation shows assets moving into position as we speak. Control replied. Recommend immediate evacuation of current location. The line went dead, leaving Stephen staring at the silent phone like it had just delivered his own obituary. Danny's voice cut through the sudden silence with sharp urgency. Black SUV just pulled up across the street, tinted windows, multiple occupants, and they're not getting out. His hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, though he suspected whatever was coming would require more firepower than his department issued sidearm could provide. Stephen closed the briefcase with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to project calm, while his mind shifted into tactical mode, analyzing sight lines, escape routes, and defensive positions within the confined space of the diner. The transformation was immediate and complete. The quiet man who had been reading newspapers and sipping coffee was gone, replaced by someone who had survived situations that would have broken lesser individuals. Marilyn. Stephen called to the diner owner, his voice carrying new authority. I need you to lock all the doors and windows and keep everyone away from the front of the building. The older woman didn't question the order, instead moving with surprising speed to secure her establishment. While her customers watched in growing alarm, Sarah pulled out her radio, preparing to call for backup, but Stephen caught her wrist gently but firmly. Officer, those people out there are not going to respond to badges or warnings. They're professionals who have been hired to complete a specific mission, and they will consider anyone who interferes to be an acceptable casualty. The weight of Stephen's words settled over the diner like a suffocating blanket as the full implications became clear to everyone present. What had begun as a routine morning had transformed into a hostage situation with stakes that none of them fully understood. The comfortable familiarity of cracked vinyl booths and chrome fixtures now felt like props in a theater of war. Ernie swiveled on his counter stool to face the room, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience with human nature and the capacity for violence that lurked beneath civilized surfaces. Been watching people all my life, he said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. And I can tell when a man's been tested by fire. This fellow here didn't get those scars from falling off bicycles. Danny moved away from the window, his face pale with the realization that his small-town police training had not prepared him for this level of threat. Sarah, we need to evacuate these people before whatever's in that SUV decides to make their move. His voice carried new respect for the gravity of their situation. Negative, Stephen replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Those contractors are watching every exit, and they have orders to secure the briefcase regardless of civilian casualties. Our best chance is defensive positioning until we can establish communication with legitimate federal authorities. Marilyn emerged from behind the counter carrying a double-barreled shotgun that looked like it had seen action in conflicts spanning decades. This establishment has weathered everything from economic depression to natural disasters, she announced with steely determination. It's not going down without a fight today. The sight of the elderly diner owner armed and ready for battle would have been comical under different circumstances. But the grim reality of their situation had stripped away any possibility of humor. The morning sun continued streaming through the windows, but its warm light now illuminated faces marked by fear, determination, and the kind of resolve that emerged when ordinary people were pushed beyond their comfort zones into extraordinary circumstances. Stephen looked around the diner, taking in the faces of people who had become his allies through circumstances none of them could have predicted. The quiet man who had sought anonymity had instead found a community willing to stand with him against threats they barely understood. The irony was not lost on him that in trying to protect these innocent people, he might have sealed all their fates. The black SUV's doors opened with mechanical precision, disgorging four figures dressed in dark tactical gear who moved with the coordinated efficiency of a military unit. Their faces were hidden behind sunglasses and communication equipment, but their purpose was unmistakably clear as they spread out to cover all possible escape routes from the diner. Their movements were economical, professional, devoid of the uncertainty that marked amateur operations. Steven positioned himself behind the counter using the solid oak structure as cover, while his eyes cataloged every detail of the establishment's interior architecture, the placement of tables and chairs, the structural integrity of walls and windows, the location of potential weapons and defensive positions. His military training had taught him to see every environment as a potential battlefield. "Sarah, take position by the kitchen door," Steven commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life or death. Tactical situations, "Danny, cover the back exit and keep the civilians low and away from windows." The two officers moved without question, their training recognizing expertise when they encountered it regardless of its source. Marilyn clutched her shotgun with hands that showed no tremor despite her age. The weapon seemed to belong in her grasp, as if it were an extension of her will rather than a tool of violence. "Ran moonshine through these mountains during Prohibition," she said matter-of-factly. "Learned long ago that sometimes talking isn't enough to settle disputes." The first contractor approached the front door, testing the handle with careful deliberation before producing a small device that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Rather than a small-town confrontation, the electronic lockpick worked with silent efficiency, bypassing Marilyn's security measures as if they were suggestions rather than barriers. Ernie had positioned himself behind the coffee counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug that could serve as an improvised weapon if necessary. "Served 2 tours in Korea," he announced to anyone within hearing. "Figured my fighting days were behind me, but apparently the universe had other plans." The front door swung open with deliberate slowness, revealing the lead contractor, who stood silhouetted against the morning sunlight like a figure from a nightmare. His tactical vest bristled with equipment that spoke of serious preparation for serious violence, the kind of gear that suggested this was not his first extraction operation. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Steven Seagal, the contractor's voice was amplified by electronic equipment, making it sound inhuman, mechanical. "You have materials that belong to our employers. Surrender them now, and civilian casualties can be avoided." The offer was delivered without emotion, as if he were reading ingredients from a recipe rather than threatening innocent lives. Steven rose from his position behind the counter, the briefcase clutched in his left hand, while his right remained free for whatever action might be required. "Those materials are evidence of crimes committed by your employer," he replied, his voice carrying across the diner with quiet authority. "They belong in the hands of legitimate law enforcement, not buried in some corporate vault." The contractor took a step into the diner, his movements precise and calculated as his eyes swept the interior, taking inventory of potential threats and tactical advantages. "Mr. Seagal, you have 30 seconds to comply before we implement alternative extraction procedures." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah's radio crackled with static as she attempted to reach dispatch, but the signal was being jammed by sophisticated equipment that reduced her calls for backup to electronic noise. The isolation was complete, turning the diner into an island surrounded by hostile forces with no immediate prospect of rescue. Danny's hands shook slightly as he gripped his service weapon, knowing that his department-issued sidearm was woefully inadequate against the military-grade equipment carried by the contractors, but his training and oath compelled him to stand ready despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. "Time's up," the contractor announced as he raised his weapon with professional efficiency, the morning sunlight reflecting off the barrel like a promise of violence that would transform the peaceful diner into a battlefield where innocent people would pay the price for secrets they had never wanted to know. Steven moved with explosive speed, diving behind a booth as the first shots shattered the morning calm, sending ceramic plates and coffee cups flying in all directions. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, transforming the familiar comfort of breakfast conversation into a symphony of chaos and terror. Marilyn's shotgun boomed with authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The blast, catching one contractor in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's toy. The elderly woman's face showed no satisfaction in the violence, only grim determination to protect her establishment and the people within it. The battle for Marilyn's diner had begun in earnest, transforming a place of community gathering into a war zone where the difference between heroism and survival became impossible to distinguish. The morning that had started with quiet conversations over coffee and bacon had become a fight for truth, justice, and the right to choose one's own destiny. Sarah found herself pressed against the kitchen wall as bullets splintered the wood above her head, sending splinters raining down like deadly confetti. Her police training had prepared her for many scenarios, but not for this level of military-style assault on civilian territory. The radio continued crackling uselessly in her hand. Stephen's movements were fluid and precise as he used the diner's familiar geography to his advantage, turning tables and chairs into impromptu fortifications while conserving ammunition and minimizing exposure to the contractor's superior firepower. His face showed no fear, only the cold calculation of someone who had faced death many times before. The second contractor attempted to flank through the side window, his movements betraying military precision honed through years of urban warfare. But he had not anticipated encountering Ernie's surprisingly agile response. The elderly man, drawing upon reflexes forged in distant mountains where survival had depended on split-second decisions, swung his heavy ceramic mug with the kind of precision that comes from having once fought for his life against enemies who showed no mercy. The improvised weapon connected with satisfying force, the solid crack of ceramic against tactical helmet echoing through the diner like a gunshot, sending the intruder stumbling backward into Marilyn's carefully arranged display of local crafts. The collision exploded in a cascade of pottery shards and wooden trinkets, the destruction of peaceful artistry by instruments of violence, serving as a metaphor for the larger forces at work in their small corner of America. Stephen vaulted over the counter with fluid grace that spoke eloquently of years spent maintaining physical readiness despite his carefully constructed civilian facade. His movements possessed an economy of motion that marked him as someone who had trained extensively in close-quarters combat, each action flowing seamlessly into the next without wasted energy or hesitation. His hands found the contractor's weapon with practiced efficiency, fingers moving with the kind of muscle memory that comes from countless hours of repetitive training under stress conditions. The disarming technique he employed was both brutal and precisely controlled, combining elements of military combatives with street-fighting pragmatism that left no doubt about his operational background. The unconscious form collapsed among scattered menus and broken dishware, joining the detritus of what had been a peaceful morning meal service before violence had shattered the illusion of small-town tranquility. "Danny, move left and cover the kitchen," Stephen commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with the kind of authority that comes naturally to those who have led men in combat. The transformation from quiet civilian to tactical coordinator was complete and unsettling, revealing layers of training and experience that ran far deeper than his mild-mannered exterior had suggested. He assessed the tactical situation with the cold precision of someone who had survived similar encounters in places far more hostile than small-town America, his eyes automatically cataloging fields of fire, cover positions, and potential escape routes with the efficiency of a combat veteran. His voice carried the unmistakable authority of experience earned through trials that most people could barely imagine, let alone survive with their sanity intact. Sarah found herself moving without conscious thought, her body responding to Stephen's commands even as her mind struggled to process the surreal transformation of her morning routine into something resembling a military operation. Her police training was merging with something deeper and more primal, instincts that evolution had embedded in the human survival mechanism when faced with immediate threats to life and safety. She helped corral the terrified customers into the relative safety of the kitchen area, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, terror, and the kind of disbelief that comes when ordinary reality is suddenly shattered by extraordinary violence. The fear in their eyes reflected her own internal struggle, but also the determination that emerged when ordinary people were pushed beyond their normal limits by circumstances that demanded heroic responses from decidedly unheroic individuals. The third contractor breached the back entrance with military precision that spoke of extensive training in urban warfare tactics, his movements coordinated with his partners through communication systems and rehearsed procedures that marked these men as professionals rather than common criminals. However, Danny was waiting with his service weapon drawn and his courage steeled by the growing realization that everything he had sworn to protect was under direct assault from forces that seemed to operate outside the normal boundaries of law enforcement. The exchange of gunfire was brief and decisive, lasting perhaps 3 seconds, but seeming to stretch into hours as adrenaline dilated time and sharpened every sense to supernatural clarity. The intruder dropped with a shoulder wound that would require medical attention but would not permanently disable him, Danny's training and natural restraint preventing him from using lethal force even under extreme circumstances. Marilyn reloaded her shotgun with movements that spoke eloquently of muscle memory developed over decades of rural self-reliance, her hands working with the kind of efficiency that comes from having handled firearms since childhood in an environment where self-defense was a practical necessity rather than an abstract concept. Her weathered face showed no regret for the violence she had inflicted, only a fierce satisfaction that her establishment and its people remained under her protection, despite the overwhelming force arrayed against them. "Nobody threatens my customers," she muttered with the kind of pride that comes from having built something worth defending through years of hard work and dedication to community service. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost involved in that defense. The fourth contractor, recognizing that the initial assault had failed catastrophically, dragged his wounded partner back toward the black SUV while speaking rapidly into his communication device. His retreat was clearly tactical rather than permanent, a professional regrouping that suggested the first assault had been designed as a probing action to test the defender's capabilities and resolve rather than a serious attempt to secure the objective. The methodical nature of his withdrawal indicated that these men operated according to established protocols for dealing with unexpected resistance, which meant they would return with additional resources and modified tactics designed to overcome the defenses they had encountered. Stephen secured the unconscious contractor with plastic zip ties produced from somewhere in his seemingly endless supply of useful items, his movements efficient and practiced as he searched the man's tactical vest for identification and intelligence. The documents he recovered made Sarah's blood run cold as she recognized the logo of Phoenix Security Solutions, a private military company with connections to some of the darkest chapters in recent American foreign policy. The corporate insignia represented the privatization of warfare that had emerged in the aftermath of global conflicts, where profit motives had gradually replaced patriotic service as the primary motivation for military action. Phoenix Security Solutions, Sarah read from the contractor's identification, her voice reflecting growing horror as the implications became clear to everyone present. These people have contracts with the Defense Department. They're not just mercenaries. They're officially sanctioned mercenaries operating under legal authority that most law enforcement agencies cannot challenge or override. The realization that they were facing opponents with government backing transformed their situation from a criminal matter into something approaching treason, with all the terrifying implications that such an escalation entailed. Danny knelt beside the wounded contractor, applying pressure to the man's shoulder wound with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and the growing realization that he had just engaged in combat with operators who possessed legal authorization to use lethal force in pursuit of their objectives. The man's tactical gear and professional demeanor marked him as former military, probably special operations, which meant his team possessed training and resources that far exceeded anything a small-town police department could match in direct confrontation. "Officer, you need to understand something," the wounded contractor said through gritted teeth, his voice carrying the kind of resignation that comes from recognizing that a mission has failed beyond any possibility of salvage. "The materials Your friend is carrying implicate people at the highest levels of government. They contain evidence of operations that officially never happened and people who officially never existed. The kind of information that entire administrations have been built on keeping secret, regardless of the cost in human lives or democratic principles. Stephen's face darkened as he processed the contractor's words, recognizing implications that went far beyond his personal safety or even the safety of everyone in the diner. The confirmation that his suspicions had been correct brought no satisfaction, only a deeper understanding of how completely he had been betrayed by the system he had served with unwavering loyalty. "What kind of operations?" he demanded, his voice carrying the edge of someone who had already paid too high a price for government secrets and was prepared to pay even more if necessary to see justice done. "Arms sales to countries under embargo," the contractor continued, his training apparently including provisions for information sharing under certain tactical circumstances where mission compromise was inevitable. "Assassination of foreign nationals. On American soil, financial support for terrorist organizations that officially remained our enemies, manipulation of congressional votes through blackmail and bribery. The kind of truth that could bring down entire administrations and reshape American foreign policy for generations to come." The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the familiar aromas of coffee and bacon created a surreal atmosphere in the damaged diner, the juxtaposition of violence and domesticity serving as a stark reminder of how quickly normalcy could be shattered by forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Stephen carefully opened the briefcase once again, his movements deliberate and reverent like a priest handling sacred relics that contained the power to transform or destroy everything they touched. The morning sunlight streaming through bullet-shattered windows illuminated documents that represented years of careful documentation and personal risk, pages that had cost him everything he had once held dear in service to a truth that most people would find too terrible to believe. "The operation was called Blackwater Dawn," Stephen began, his voice carrying the weight of memories that had haunted him through 3 years of exile and enforced anonymity in places where his former life could never reach him. The name itself carried sinister implications, evoking images of private military contractors operating in moral twilight zones where traditional rules of engagement held no meaning. Officially, it never existed, but the financial records in this case prove that $47 million in taxpayer money was funneled through a complex network of shell companies to purchase weapons that were then sold to regimes we were publicly condemning as enemies of democracy and human rights. Sarah positioned herself strategically where she could simultaneously guard the main entrance and listen to Stephen's confession, her service weapon drawn but lowered as she processed the magnitude of what she was hearing. Her notepad lay forgotten on a nearby table as she realized she was witnessing testimony that could reshape American foreign policy and potentially bring down government officials at the highest levels of power. The scope of the corruption was staggering in its breadth and implications, suggesting a systematic betrayal of public trust that extended far beyond individual criminal acts into the realm of institutional failure on a scale that threatened the very foundations of democratic governance. Danny methodically checked the wounded contractor's pulse while keeping one ear carefully tuned to Stephen's words, the professional part of his mind noting that the man was unconscious but stable, while the citizen in him reeled from the implications of what was being revealed. The wounded man represented more than just an immediate tactical threat. He was a living reminder that the stakes of this revelation extended far beyond the walls of Marilyn's diner into corridors of power where decisions were made daily that affected millions of lives around the globe. The fact that such men could be deployed against American citizens on American soil suggested a level of governmental overreach that challenged everything Danny had been taught about constitutional protections and civil liberties. The arms sales were just the beginning, Stephen continued, his fingers tracing the edge of a photograph that showed him standing beside men whose faces had appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the world, usually in connection with allegations of war crimes or crimes against humanity. The image captured a moment from what seemed like another lifetime, when he had believed himself to be serving the greater good rather than being manipulated by forces that cared nothing for the principles he had sworn to defend. The real money came from what we euphemistically called ghost operations, assassinations of foreign nationals who were getting too close to exposing the truth about American involvement in activities that violated every treaty and moral principle our nation claimed to represent. Marilyn swept broken glass into a dustpan with mechanical precision, her actions providing a desperately needed sense of normalcy that helped ground the surreal conversation taking place in her destroyed establishment. She had witnessed enough human nature during her decades of serving the public to understand that evil often wore the mask of authority and respectability, that the most dangerous criminals were frequently those who operated under the protection of official sanction. Her movements were steady and purposeful, a testament to the kind of practical courage that had built communities across America despite the corruption and betrayal that seemed to flourish in the corridors of power far from the honest work of ordinary citizens. Ernie moved closer to examine the documents with the careful attention of someone who had learned through hard experience that details mattered when powerful people were determined to hide the truth. His weathered eyes, which had witnessed the rise and fall of governments across multiple decades, reflected the wisdom that comes from having seen history made by flawed human beings operating under the pressure of impossible circumstances. These names, he said, pointing to a list of signatures with a trembling finger that spoke of age and emotion rather than fear. Some of these people are still in positions of power, making decisions about wars and peace while having blood on their hands that may never wash clean. Agent Marcus Webb was my handler, Stevens said, his voice breaking slightly as he reached the most painful part of his story, the betrayal that had shattered not just his career, but his fundamental faith in the institutions that had shaped his entire adult life. The name emerged like a confession torn from his soul, carrying with it years of suppressed anger and grief for the man he had once considered a mentor and friend. He was the one who recruited me, convinced me that we were serving the greater good, even when the mission seemed to contradict everything I had sworn to defend as an American serviceman. When I started asking questions about the ultimate objectives of our operations, he systematically set me up to take the fall for crimes I had committed in service to what I believed was my country. The betrayal was written in every line of Stephen's face as he relived the moment when his trust had been shattered along with his faith in everything he had held sacred, the documents before them representing not just evidence of crimes, but proof of personal destruction on a scale that few people could fully comprehend. The transformation from decorated operative to hunted fugitive had happened with bureaucratic efficiency, leaving him stripped of identity, resources, and hope in the span of a few carefully orchestrated weeks. His former colleagues had been turned against him through a combination of fabricated evidence and carefully leaked rumors that painted him as a rogue agent who had sold out his country for personal gain. Sarah found herself believing every word despite the incredible nature of the accusations. The consistency of the evidence combined with Stephen's obvious emotional pain, creating a narrative that resonated with truth rather than the elaborate fiction it might have seemed under different circumstances. The man before her bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had sacrificed everything for principles that had ultimately been revealed as illusions, his suffering authentic in ways that could not be fabricated or rehearsed. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" she asked, her voice gentle with the kind of understanding that comes from recognizing genuine anguish when confronted with it. "Who would believe me?" Stephen replied with a bitter laugh that contained no humor, only the hollow sound of dreams dying in the face of institutional indifference to justice. A disgraced operative making accusations against decorated officials whose service records were filled with commendations and whose reputations had been carefully cultivated over decades of public service? My credibility was systematically destroyed before I ever had a chance to present evidence. The system perfectly designed to protect itself rather than to seek truth or justice for the people it claimed to serve. Danny's radio crackled with updates from dispatch as backup units finally began responding to the emergency call, but the complications of their situation were becoming clearer with each passing minute as the scope of federal involvement became apparent. Local law enforcement agencies lacked both the resources and the legal authority necessary to handle evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of national government, their jurisdiction ending precisely where the real power began. The approaching sirens represented help that might prove inadequate to the challenge they faced, well-meaning officers walking into a situation that transcended their training and authority. The briefcase also contains financial records showing direct payments to sitting members of Congress. Stephen continued, his revelation gaining momentum as years of suppressed truth finally found voice through someone willing to listen without immediate judgment or dismissal. The documents detailed a web of corruption that extended through multiple branches of government, creating a system of mutual complicity that made finding trustworthy authorities seem almost impossible. Kickbacks for voting in favor of defense. Contracts that fed money back into the very operations they were supposed to provide oversight for, creating a closed loop of corruption that enriched private contractors while bleeding the treasury and compromising national security. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications, suggesting that democratic processes had been systematically subverted by financial interests that operated without regard for constitutional limitations or moral boundaries. The evidence suggested that entire congressional committees had been compromised, their votes purchased through a combination of campaign contributions, personal payments, and carefully orchestrated blackmail schemes that left elected officials with no choice but to cooperate with demands that violated their oaths of office. Marilyn set down her broom and approached the briefcase with the kind of curiosity that had served her well through decades of reading people and situations, her practical wisdom cutting through the complexity to focus on essential human motivations. Son, these documents could get you killed a dozen times over, she observed with the directness that came from a lifetime of calling things by their proper names. Why risk everything to preserve them when you could have disappeared completely and lived a quiet life somewhere safe? Her question cut to the heart of Stephen's motivation, challenging him to articulate the principles that had driven him to maintain his dangerous burden despite every rational reason to abandon it. Because 43 people died during those operations, Stephen replied, his voice carrying the weight of individual names and faces that haunted his dreams with the persistence of unresolved guilt and responsibility. Each number represented a human life cut short in service to lies that had enriched private contractors while destabilizing entire regions of the world in pursuit of profit disguised as patriotism. Good people who believed they were serving their country while being manipulated by individuals who cared more about quarterly profit statements than the principles that supposedly distinguished America from the authoritarian regimes we claim to oppose. They deserve to have their stories told, their sacrifices acknowledged, and their deaths investigated by people who still believe that truth matters more than political expedience. The dawn that broke over Marilyn's diner painted the bullet-scarred windows with golden light that seemed almost mocking in its beauty, as if nature itself was indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded within the establishment's familiar walls. The arriving police cars created a constellation of red and blue lights that transformed the quiet street into something resembling a crime scene from a major metropolitan area rather than the peaceful rural community it had been just hours earlier. Sheriff Margaret Coleman emerged from the lead vehicle, her weathered face reflecting decades of experience with human nature and small-town emergencies, but nothing in her background had prepared her for the scene that greeted her inside the diner: overturned tables, bullet holes in vintage fixtures, and the unmistakable smell of gunpowder mixing with the lingering aroma of coffee created an atmosphere that belonged in a war zone rather than a breakfast establishment. "Danny, what in the hell happened here?" Sheriff Coleman demanded as she surveyed the damage with professional eyes that missed nothing, from the zip-tied contractor to the shotgun still cradled in Marilyn's arms to the briefcase that seemed to pulse with dangerous potential despite its innocent leather exterior. Sarah stepped forward to provide the briefing, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the events she was about to describe. "Sheriff, we have evidence of federal crimes involving conspiracy, assassination, and corruption at the highest levels of government. The situation requires immediate coordination with federal authorities and witness protection protocols." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the sheriff thought she understood about her jurisdiction and responsibilities. The small-town police work that had defined her career suddenly seemed inadequate for the scope of what her officers had uncovered. Stephen stood quietly beside the damaged counter, his posture reflecting the exhaustion of someone who had carried a Heavy burden for too long, the briefcase remained at his side like a faithful companion that had shared his exile and was now witnessing his return to a world he had tried desperately to leave behind. Mr. Seagal, Sheriff Coleman addressed him directly. Her tone respectful but firm. I need to understand exactly what kind of evidence we're dealing with here and what level of federal involvement is going to be required to handle it properly. The question forced Stephen to confront the reality that his years of hiding were definitively over. The quiet life he had built in the shadow of anonymity was about to be sacrificed on the altar of justice and truth. The irony was not lost on him that in trying to protect innocent people, he had ensured that none of their lives would ever be the same. Sheriff, the documents in this briefcase contain evidence of war crimes committed by American operatives under direct orders from officials who are still serving in high-ranking positions. Stephen replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the full implications of what he was saying. The scope of the conspiracy extends through multiple agencies and includes sitting members of Congress. Marilyn moved through her damaged diner with the practical efficiency of someone who had weathered many storms and understood that survival required focusing on what could be controlled rather than mourning what had been lost. Well, she announced to no one in particular, I suppose. This means we're all going to be famous whether we want to be or not. The observation carried more truth than humor as the reality settled over everyone present that their involvement in the morning's events had transformed them from anonymous small-town residents into key witnesses in what could become one of the most significant political scandals in American history. Ernie approached Sheriff Coleman with the careful dignity of someone who had lived long enough to understand when history was being made. Sheriff, I've been watching that man for months, and I can tell you he's the genuine article. Whatever secrets he's been carrying, they've been eating at him like a cancer. The relief on his face now tells me he's finally ready to let go of them. The old man's endorsement carried weight in a community where his judgment had been respected for decades, his words providing a character reference that meant more than any official documentation could have accomplished. Danny stood near the window watching as federal vehicles began arriving with the kind of coordination that suggested someone had been making phone calls to very important people. Very quickly, the black SUVs and unmarked sedans created a motorcade that transformed the rural street into something resembling a presidential visit. Sarah, Stephen said quietly, I want you to know that everything that happened here today was my fault. These people, he gestured toward the other patrons, they didn't deserve to be dragged into something that should have remained between me and the people who betrayed our country. Sarah shook her head firmly, her expression reflecting the kind of moral clarity that had drawn her to law enforcement in the first place. Mr. Seagal, what happened here today was the result of corrupt officials trying to bury evidence of their crimes. You didn't create this situation, you just refused to let it stay hidden. Federal agent Rebecca Martinez entered the diner with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to crime scenes that involved national security implications. Her eyes swept the interior, taking inventory of evidence, witnesses, and potential complications. With the efficiency of someone who had handled similar situations in locations around the world, Mr. Seagal, Agent Martinez addressed Stephen directly. I'm with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and I've been authorized to offer you federal protection in exchange for your cooperation in what will likely become the largest investigation of government corruption in recent American history. The offer represented both salvation and surrender, the end of Stephen's exile, but also the beginning of a new kind of imprisonment where his life would be defined by testimony, depositions, and the constant awareness that powerful people wanted him dead. Stephen looked around the diner one final time, taking in the faces of people who had become unlikely allies in his quest for justice. Marilyn with her shotgun and fierce determination, Danny with his newfound humility and commitment to truth, Sarah with her unwavering moral compass, and Ernie with his quiet wisdom and understanding. Agent Martinez, Stephen replied, I accept your offer, but I want guarantees that everyone in this diner will receive the same level of protection. They risked their lives to help me, and they deserve to be safe from the consequences of that choice. The negotiation established the terms under which Stephen would finally emerge from the shadows and confront the people who had destroyed his life and the lives of 43 other patriots who had died serving what they believed was their country's interests. Marilyn began collecting personal items from behind the counter, her movements reflecting acceptance of the reality that her diner would be closed for the foreseeable future while serving as evidence in a federal investigation 40 years I've been serving breakfast in this place, she mused. Never thought it would end with me in witness protection. The transformation was complete. The quiet man who had sought anonymity in a corner booth had become the central figure in a conspiracy that would reshape American politics, while the innocent people who had shared his morning routine had become heroes in a story they had never chosen. To join Agent Martinez coordinated with Sheriff Coleman to establish security protocols while federal crime scene technicians began documenting evidence that would eventually fill multiple filing cabinets in Washington bureaucrats' offices. The machinery of justice was beginning to turn, albeit slowly, and with the grinding reluctance of institutions that preferred secrecy to transparency. Danny approached Stephen with the humility of someone who had learned a painful lesson about the dangers of rushing to judgment. Mr. Seagal, I owe you an apology. I let my ego and my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I nearly cost all of us our lives. Stephen extended his hand in a gesture of forgiveness that spoke to the kind of man he truly was beneath the layers of training and trauma. Officer Harris, we all make mistakes. The measure of a person is what they do when they realize they were wrong. You stood up when it mattered, and that's what I'll remember. The handshake represented more than personal reconciliation. It symbolized the possibility that truth could triumph over deception and that ordinary people could stand against corruption regardless of how powerful or well-connected the perpetrators might be. Sarah secured the crime scene with professional thoroughness while processing the reality that her small town police work had intersected with events that would be studied in political science classes for decades to come. The quiet morning that had begun with routine patrol duties had become a defining moment in her career and her understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. As the federal convoy prepared to escort Stephen and the other witnesses to secure locations, the diner stood empty for the first time in 4 decades, its silence broken only by the whisper of wind through bullet-shattered windows and the distant sound of traffic resuming its normal patterns on streets that would never feel quite the same. Stephen paused at the threshold of the diner, looking back at the place where his exile had ended and his quest for justice had finally found allies worthy of the truth he had protected for so long. The briefcase felt lighter in his hand, as if the burden of carrying secrets alone had been the heaviest weight of all. 3 weeks had passed since the morning that transformed Marilyn's diner from a quiet breakfast spot into the epicenter of a federal investigation that dominated newspaper headlines and cable news broadcasts across the nation. The bullet holes had been repaired and the damaged fixtures replaced, but the atmosphere within the establishment retained a subtle electricity that spoke of momentous events and lives forever changed. Marilyn stood behind the counter polishing coffee cups with mechanical precision, while her eyes remained fixed on the corner booth that had become something of a shrine to the man who had sat there every morning reading his newspaper and nursing his coffee in the kind of peaceful anonymity that seemed impossible in hindsight. The red vinyl seat showed no outward signs of the secrets that had been harbored there, but everyone who entered the diner was drawn to that particular spot. The morning regulars had returned gradually, their conversations hushed and reverent as if they were occupying sacred ground, where history had been made through the actions of ordinary people who had chosen courage over comfort when circumstances demanded heroism from the most unlikely sources. Ernie occupied his usual stool at the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had somehow survived the gunfight that had transformed their quiet community into a footnote in American political history. His eyes held the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been vindicated by events that proved the importance of trusting one's judgment about human character. Never did get his real name, you know, Ernie observed to Marilyn as she refilled his cup with coffee that steamed in the morning air. Called himself Steven Seagal, but that was probably just another cover identity, protecting himself and protecting us from knowing too much about the kind of man we were sharing breakfast with. The newspaper lying open on the counter displayed headlines that had become familiar over the past weeks: congressional investigations, FBI raids, and the resignation of 3 high-ranking officials whose names had appeared in the documents that Stephen had protected with his life. And his exile, the scandal had reached into the highest levels of government, fulfilling every prediction he had made about the explosive nature of his evidence. Danny Harris entered the diner with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned valuable lessons about judgment, humility, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. His uniform was pressed to the same military standards as always, but his demeanor reflected hard-won wisdom about the complexity of human nature and the dangers of assumptions. "Morning, Marilyn," Danny said as he claimed a booth near the window, his eyes automatically scanning the street with the heightened awareness of someone who had experienced genuine danger in this most unlikely of settings. "Any word from our federal friends about when we might expect some normal, boring small-town police work to resume?" Marilyn poured coffee, without being asked, her maternal instincts having expanded to include the young officer who had transformed from antagonist to ally through the crucible of shared danger. "Agent Martinez called yesterday to say the initial depositions are complete, but the investigation is expected to continue for at least another year, possibly longer, depending on how many people decide to cooperate rather than fight the charges." The scope of the investigation had exceeded everyone's expectations, as Stephen's evidence had opened doors to other cases, other conspiracies, other victims who had been silenced by the same network of corruption that had destroyed his career and forced him into exile. The briefcase had contained not just proof of specific crimes, but a roadmap to systematic abuse of power that reached back decades. Sarah Lopez pushed through the entrance carrying a manila folder that contained updates from the federal task force that had been established to coordinate the various investigations spawned by Stephen's revelations. Her face showed the strain of someone who had been working 18-hour days while processing the reality that her small-town police work had intersected with events of national significance. "Danny, we've got 3 more federal agents arriving this afternoon to interview witnesses from the morning of the incident," Sarah announced as she slid into the booth across from her partner. "Apparently, our testimonies are crucial to establishing the timeline and the credibility of the evidence, the transformation of their quiet police department into a hub of federal activity had been surreal but necessary as investigators worked to build cases that would withstand the inevitable challenges from defense attorneys representing some of the most powerful people in America. The stakes could not have been higher, and everyone involved understood that failure would mean not just personal disappointment, but the continuation of systematic corruption. A young woman entered the diner carrying a digital camera and notepad, her press credentials identifying her as a reporter from a major newspaper who had been assigned to write a follow-up story about the human impact of the scandal that was reshaping American politics. Her eyes moved immediately to the corner booth that had become synonymous with the explosive revelations. "Excuse me," the reporter addressed Marilyn with professional courtesy. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Washington Herald. I was hoping to speak with some of the people who were present during the incident 3 weeks ago. The public is very interested in understanding how ordinary citizens became heroes in one of the most significant political scandals in recent memory." Marilyn's expression reflected the wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of people asking questions about events that had already brought enough attention to her establishment. "We've told our stories to the federal investigators, and we're cooperating fully with the official investigation. I'm not sure there's much more to say to the press." The reporter's persistence was gentle but determined as she explained that public understanding of the human element was crucial to maintaining support for the investigation and the prosecutions that would follow. The abstract concept of government corruption became more real and more urgent when people could connect with the individuals who had risked everything to expose the truth. Ernie swiveled on his stool to face the reporter, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience with human nature and the importance of standing up for what was right. "Young lady, what happened here wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about ordinary people who had to choose between what was safe and what was right. When the moment demanded a decision." The old man's words carried the weight of lived experience and moral clarity that resonated with everyone present. The morning of gunfire and federal agents had been extraordinary, but the courage displayed by the diner's patrons represented something more fundamental about human nature and the capacity for good people to rise to meet extraordinary circumstances. Danny looked up from his coffee cup, his expression reflecting the ongoing process of understanding the magnitude of what they had all experienced. That man who sat in that booth every morning for months, we all made assumptions about who he was and what he represented, but none of us really knew him until the moment when everything depended on whether we would stand with him or against him. The revelation about their own capacity for misjudgment had been as shocking as the discovery of Stephen's true identity. The quiet man who had seemed unremarkable had been carrying the weight of evidence that could topple governments, while the local residents who shared his morning routine had been capable of heroism that surprised even themselves. Sarah opened her folder to reveal photographs and documents that had been declassified for public release, showing some of the evidence that Stephen had protected during his years of exile. The faces in the photographs included officials whose names were familiar from newspaper headlines and television news broadcasts. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering in its reach and audacity. The federal prosecutors believe they have enough evidence to secure convictions on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to treason, Sarah explained to the reporter, but the defense attorneys are already arguing that the evidence was obtained through illegal means and should be excluded from trial. The legal battles that lay ahead would determine whether Stephen's sacrifice and the risks taken by everyone in the diner had been worthwhile, or whether the corruption would be allowed to continue hidden behind legal technicalities and procedural challenges. The stakes extended far beyond personal vindication to the fundamental question of whether justice could prevail against institutional power. Marilyn retrieved a leather-bound journal from beneath the cash register, its pages filled with the thoughts and observations she had recorded during the weeks following the incident that had transformed her diner into a symbol of ordinary people taking extraordinary stands against corruption. I've been writing down everything I remember about that morning and about the man we thought we knew, she said quietly. The journal represented more than personal recollection. It was a testament to the importance of bearing witness to truth and preserving the memory of moments when individual choices shaped historical outcomes. The quiet observations of a small-town diner owner had become part of the official record of one of the most significant political scandals in American history. Danny stood to leave for his afternoon patrol, his movement triggering the familiar chime of the doorbells that had announced arrivals and departures through decades of ordinary days and one extraordinary morning that changed everything. Whoever he really was, Danny said, looking back at the corner booth, he taught us something important about the difference between what people appear to be and who they really are when everything is on the line. The lesson extended beyond the specific circumstances of that violent morning to fundamental questions about judgment, trust, and the capacity for redemption that existed within even the most damaged individuals. Stephen's transformation from suspected criminal to heroic whistleblower had been dramatic, but it reflected deeper truths about human nature and the possibility of positive change. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the repaired windows of Marilyn's diner, the corner booth remained empty, but not forgotten, a symbol of the quiet courage displayed by a man who had chosen truth over safety and inspired others to make similar choices when their moment of testing arrived. The scandal that emerged from that briefcase continued to reshape American politics, but the human story of ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage remained the most important legacy of the man they had misjudged. The newspaper on Ernie's counter carried an editorial titled "The Stranger Among Us," written by an anonymous author who understood that every community harbored individuals whose true character remained hidden until circumstances demanded revelation. The words served as both tribute and warning about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to the deeper truths that defined human worth. Marilyn folded the journal closed and returned it to its place beneath the cash register, where it would remain as a reminder that history was made not just by famous people in distant places, but by ordinary individuals who chose courage when their moment of testing arrived. The corner booth would remain empty, but the lessons learned that morning would echo through the community for generations to come. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.